Thank you so much for joining us, Emily. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me.
So, a little bit about you is that you have a new book that's coming out. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's called Decoding the Cosmos, God, Physics, and the Search for Deeper Explanation. And it's being published by Cascade in November. But pre-order is available now. So if this comes out before November, you can order a copy right now.
And it should come out before November, so go check that out. But tell us, can you tell us a little bit about the background of what led to this book? What's your research and how ultimately this saw the light of day?
Yeah, so it's a big question, and I could give you a really long answer. I don't want to bore people. But basically, the book is a culmination of essentially my whole career in science and religion. So I first came across the theological subdiscipline, I guess, of science and religion 10 years ago when I was an undergraduate. So I took the undergraduate paper, Science and Religion, at Oxford. And I was just absolutely fascinated with the whole idea that you can have this interdisciplinary conversation between religion, science, and philosophy on such a breadth of questions. So immediately I was hooked. But I was particularly interested in physics. And the religious context that I was in was Christianity. I was raised in a sort of Christian environment. I'm not religious myself, but my granddad was a priest. So culturally Christian, I guess, although I very much identify as an atheist. Um, and so that's where it sort of began. And then over the last 10 years since then, I've done a master's and a PhD in science and religion, and I focused on physics and Christianity. My PhD and my master's focused on the philosophy and physics of time and the implications of that for salvation. And that was the topic of my first two books. But I've also written papers on all sorts of other stuff in physics and Christianity. And essentially, an editor at Cascade approached me and said, "We're looking for somebody to write a book on physics and theology that's for an introductory audience, think like lay people who are interested in these ideas but aren't necessarily formally trained, or undergraduates. I mean, anyone who's interested in this kind of stuff but isn't an expert." And that sounded super interesting to me. So that's when I started writing it, gosh, 2 or 3 years ago now. And it's essentially bringing together all the research I've done over the last few years, but translating that into accessible language so that ordinary people can actually understand it. Because a lot of these academic books written are really hard for ordinary people to understand, too much jargon, assuming too much background knowledge. And so this is really trying to take readers from the beginning. I talk a bit about what science and religion is as a discipline, what science and religion are separately, and then jump into various different ways that we can think about physics and theology coming together. Are they compatible? Are they not? Yeah, so that's kind of how the book came to be, and the idea behind it.
Awesome. Well, in the book, the first topic you cover is creation and how have Christians reacted to contemporary physics and the Big Bang Theory. Uh, Sorry, I think I misread the question. Seth, did I do the wrong one? You can cut this when you're cutting out all the swear words.
You're off to a great start, aren't you,
No,
Jonathan?
Was I supposed to do question two?
It's like
All right,
you've
I'll
never
do
done this before. No. So the first topic you cover is actually, it deals with physics and how Christians have dealt with physics, the Big Bang Theory, that sort of stuff. Can you tell us a bit about that chapter?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, yeah, the first chapter is creation. I'll just say a brief word on the structure of the book. So essentially what I'm doing is taking 5 key Christian doctrines, 5 big Christian ideas, and seeing how those relate to or are impacted by physics. So I start with creation, and then I go to design, then providence, then incarnation and salvation. So I'm essentially following the kind of salvation historical narrative of Christian theology and organizing the physics material around the theological material. So we've got the theological system and then how physics fits in. So the first chapter, yeah, is on creation. And the main area of physics that I talk about there is cosmology. So cosmologists have come to the conclusion after much after lots of a kind of slow process of discovery and then reaction against it throughout the 20th century, they've come to the conclusion that the universe is around 13.75 billion years old, and it burst into existence at a particular moment in the finite past, known as the Big Bang. So that's the Big Bang theory. It's probably familiar to everybody. And there have been some interesting reactions. So when it was being developed in the middle of the 20th century, the Pope actually said, well, this is fantastic. This is evidence of a moment of creation. This is let there be light discovered by science. So that he's kind of in the religious camp that says the Big Bang theory, this moment is a moment of creation, essentially. But then, of course, you have another camp which says that this contradicts the Bible because it says that the universe is billions and billions of years old rather than 6,000 years old. And so you have this kind of tension between different readings of Christian scripture and the science as it stands. So in the book, I kind of go through those two different options, young earth creationism and old earth creationism. And I sort of I'm trying in the book to leave things up to the reader largely to decide, because it's not up to me, especially about questions relating to faith. But this is probably where I come down the strongest and I say, look, the science just doesn't support young earth creationism. And actually, you don't have to reject the whole of Christianity in light of science. You just have to say, okay, well, maybe the biblical authors weren't exactly right about the length that it took from the moment of creation to now. So yeah, I think that's where I come down most strongly, and I'm like, look, guys, it's not plausible scientifically, but you can still have a Christian understanding of the beginning of the universe, and that's perfectly compatible with science. You just have to think a bit more. You have to have a bit more of a nuanced and, in my view, sophisticated approach to biblical interpretation to get there.
Well, I mean, you discuss a lot of the traditional apologetic arguments that people use, you know, I mean, because creation and the constants after the Big Bang, I mean, all of this type of stuff gets used to try to support that God must exist. He must have created it. What is your general assessment of these types of apologetical arguments? What's your thought on the cosmological argument and then also on the design argument?
Well, as an atheist, I don't find them that convincing. So that's my general assessment. I think if they were good, they would have convinced me, and they haven't. I think there's a place for them, but I view their value as more of a pedagogical tool than as an actual apologetic or evangelical one. So I think they can be really helpful ways into thinking about the relationship between religion and science. They're interesting entry points for undergraduates, people new to the area. You know, can you argue for the existence of God on the basis of evidence from cosmology, like cosmic fine-tuning in some versions of the design argument, or from a universal beginning, as in some versions of the cosmological argument? But I think ultimately, I don't find them personally persuasive. I also don't know how persuasive they are in a broader sense to people. It seems to confirm the beliefs people already have, or not convince people. I don't know. People split down party lines when it comes to these apologetic arguments, which makes me think they're not very good. I don't think people come to faith because of a rational argument on the basis of scientific data. I think people come to faith for other reasons.
Well, could we maybe go for both? I mean, I'd love to dive deeper into both the cosmological argument and the design argument and hear why it's not convincing. I personally don't find the cosmological argument very convincing myself. But the design argument for me, especially when it comes to like cosmological constants and those types of things, it doesn't necessitate God created it, because you could go multiverse or you could go some other directions. But I do find it adds some probability or weight to the existence of God. Would you disagree with that it even adds a little bit of probability, or what, how would you frame it?
Yeah, so I think the design argument that uses cosmic fine-tuning is probably the most convincing one available. And when I first came across it as an undergraduate, I was like, whoa, I need to think about this a bit more, because the numbers are staggering. So for any listeners who aren't familiar with this argument, the bare bones of it, and there's a lot of technical physics involved, but the bare bones of it are, as far as we know from physics, there's a huge range of possible values that the universal constants can have. So the strength of gravity is a good example, and also the initial conditions, like the amount of carbon in the universe, that kind of thing. So there's a huge range that say the strength of gravity could have been, but there's only a really, really tiny range that's hospitable to life. So if gravity was much weaker, then the universe would have just expanded completely with no planets or stars forming, because gravity wouldn't have been strong enough to, cause that matter to collapse in on itself. Stars, planets, etc. Ultimately, life. And if gravity was much stronger, then the universe would have collapsed back in on itself so quickly that life wouldn't have had time to evolve. And it turns out that it's like, I can't remember the exact values for gravity, but it's absolutely staggering. It's like a hair's breadth on the distance from here to the moon or something. I mean, it's really, really staggering. Most people who come across this argument agree that just saying, it was probably just chance is not a good enough answer. So whether you are a theist or an atheist or an agnostic or somewhere in between, pretty much everyone agrees, okay, we need some kind of explanation for this. So one of them, as you mentioned, is the multiverse. So this is the idea that we're not living in a single universe. We're instead living in potentially an infinite multiverse, or at least lots and lots of different universe domains. Each of those have different initial conditions, different values of the constants. And so, okay, well, we're life. Of course, we find ourselves in a region of the multiverse that's conducive to life. And suddenly, if we're living in a multiverse, the probability that someone has fine-tuned these constants goes from being very, very high to very low. Of course, the theistic explanation is that, well, yeah, the constants have been fine-tuned by God intentionally so that the universe allows life to emerge. And basically, we're at a stalemate between these two, I guess, where religious people find the theistic explanation more convincing. Atheists, some will go to the multiverse, some won't. Ultimately, I think there are empirical questions that are unanswered here. So there are scientific questions that we don't have the answer to that could explain why the universe appears finely tuned when it isn't. And until we have those answers, I don't think we can make claims as ontologically costly as the existence of God. So what I mean by that is physics is incomplete. So we've got general relativity, which is a theory that explains the universe on a broad scale, like planets, galaxies, that kind of thing. We've got quantum mechanics, which explains the universe on a very small scale, so subatomic particles. And those two are incompatible. So we need a grand unified theory, a theory of everything, something deeper to explain what happens when the universe, something that's described by general relativity, was the size of a quantum object, which it was at the moment of the Big Bang. So essentially, the area of physics that's incomplete, the theory of quantum gravity, the theory of everything, is the very theory we need to understand the beginning of the universe and potentially why the laws of nature are the way they are, the initial conditions are the way they are. So maybe that's why the cosmic fine-tuning arguments, to me, aren't that persuasive, because I just think the data appears really convincing, but we don't have all the data yet. So, hurry up, physicists. We've got some unanswered questions.
So basically, we need we need a theory of everything, quantum theory of gravity that unites gravity to the other major, general relativity to quantum physics in order to truly understand how everything happened.
Yeah.
Can I ask personally, what credence do you give to the idea of a multiverse?
So I quite like the idea, but I just don't think we have enough information to say that we definitely live in one or that we definitely don't. So I've spent the last few years, when I wasn't writing Decoding the Cosmos, thinking about the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is another multiverse theory, which probably will take us on a tangent to talk about. And again, I'm not sure. I don't know. But I do think in terms of the kind of multiverse that's relevant for cosmic fine-tuning, it seems to fit with the intellectual trajectory of history in terms of like the centrality of humans in reality or in creation. So we thought that the Earth was all that really existed, and then there was the kind of the firmament and the celestial spheres, and we were at the center of everything. Then we realized actually we're on a planet orbiting the sun, so we're not even at the center of our cosmological or cosmic location. Then we discovered, then Edwin Hubble discovered the existence of other galaxies, and we realized we're not, the universe is much bigger than we thought. We exist on in a little corner of the Milky Way galaxy. There's hundreds of billions of other galaxies. So we have seen this trajectory of our centrality being continuously displaced, and the universe being continuously proved to be far, far greater than we can possibly imagine. So every time we think we understand how big the universe is, another scientific development comes along and is like, it's even bigger. So for me, discovering that we are living in a multiverse would be unsurprising from that perspective. But the issue with the multiverse is that it is seemingly a scientific question. You know, how many universes are there? What are their characteristics? But we can't, as far as we know, give a scientific answer. Because if you could measure it, it's in your universe. So we will never be able to detect, I don't think, the existence of other universes. We'll be able to say we have a grand unified theory, a theory of everything that predicts that there are multiple universes. We might be able to say with reasonable confidence, okay, we have good theoretical, philosophical, rational reasons to believe in other universes, but we can't go out and test them. So it's a question, it's a boundary question really, that science isn't going to be able to answer, at least on its own.
So you have basically a competition now between not a scientific answer and a metaphysical, philosophical answer, but between two philosophical answers to the same question.
Yeah. And sometimes people on the theistic side will say, hang on, why are you invoking a multiverse? That's an unscientific idea. I'm like, hey guys, your answer's God. That's unscientific too. Let's be comfortable with having philosophical answers at the end of this kind of train of scientific questions.
Well, I'd love to then deconstruct the cosmological argument in the same way you just did the design argument. Mm-hmm. Like, because, Big Bang shows that it did start. The religious people are like, yay, who started it? What say you to that?
Well, it'd be similar to your answer to the quantum theory of gravity, then. Would that also be the same thing?
Unverifiable.
Yeah, we don't know if it did begin.
We don't know. We do know that this universe domain in which we live began. We don't know what happened before because, again, science can't answer that. And science never will be able to answer that as far as we know. So again, we're going to have metaphysical, potentially theological answers to that. But we just don't have enough information yet to know. We don't even know how the Big Bang exactly worked because of our scientific theories breaking down before the Planck era, which is like, I can't remember the exact number, 10 to the minus 37 seconds after the Big Bang or something. But that teeny tiny sliver of time is really, really crucial to knowing exactly what went on at the beginning of the universe. And really, to answer questions raised by the cosmological argument, you need to know what happened before the universe began. And that may well be an incoherent question because before is a temporal term. And as far as we understand it, time, at least physical time, emerged at the Big Bang. So we just don't know enough. Again, I think I'm just gonna plead ignorance here and say I don't think we know enough. But that means, for me, that the most rational thing to do is to err on the side of skepticism rather than saying, okay, well, we don't know, so it must be God, because that's God of the gaps reasoning. And to me, that has a historical trajectory of being shown to be wrong time and time again. How did species come about? well, according to William Paley, God created them all in their final forms, and the harmonious working of nature together is evidence of God's beautiful design. 50 years later, Darwin comes along and says, well, actually, they evolved thanks to a process of natural selection. And then you have God, which was placed in the gap in our scientific knowledge. Where did species come from? Oh, it must be God. Displaced. This is something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer argued against. He said, we should be finding God in what we know, not what we don't know. So this God of the gaps reasoning it's theologically unappealing, as well as being off-putting to philosophers of religion who don't find religious arguments persuasive.
Man, I'd really love to talk to you about this all day, but that's only the first couple chapters of your book is dealing with the physics, because you delve into, as you noted, like Providence, eschatology, in things as well. Do you mind if I go ahead and pivot to the idea of Providence? Because I thought that was a fascinating chapter. Yeah.
No, we need to solve if God exists first, Seth. We can't. What?
This is gonna be a long podcast. I hope you guys don't have anything planned after this.
Jump in, everyone.
So in the chapter that you have on Providence, you bring in conversations about divine action. How is it that God actually providentially interacts with the world? What are some views on how God interacts with the world? How have physics been attempted to be brought in to this theological question?
Yeah, so theologians tend to split divine providence into two categories. So general providence, which is the idea that God is the creator and sustainer of the universe in a kind of broad and general sense. Without God, nothing would exist, both at the beginning of time and each subsequent moment of time. So God is the creator of the laws of nature, the initial conditions, as we've already talked about, and all of the kind of processes that go on in the world. Special providence refers to specific actions of God at particular moments in time, like miracles, answering prayers, those kind of things. So you've got God as the transcendent creator, general providence, and then God as an immanent actor, special providence. And physics has had stuff to say, or has been relevant to both of those different conceptions. So Newtonian mechanics, when it was first developed, seemed to be perfectly compatible with general providence. We have this mechanistic way of understanding the universe. Well, God set up those laws. It's a sign of a perfect creation that it just unfolds on its own. But what's difficult is special providence, because if the laws of nature are deterministic, as Newtonian mechanics suggests, then they proceed in a kind of linear fashion. The world unfolds like clockwork, and it doesn't need action from outside. But actually, maybe it can't even accommodate action from outside without breaking those laws of nature. And perhaps that would be theologically inconsistent for God to set up these laws, clearly God's will, and then have to break them in order to realize other aspects of his will. So this led to a religious or a philosophical idea called deism, which was the idea that God set up the universe and then just let it unfold. And therefore miracles, interventions and stuff don't really happen on deism. And it was fashionable for a while, but I think lots of religious people ended up rallying against it because they're like, well, we're theists, not deists. We want a God that can act in the world. That's the kind of God that was revealed to us in our scriptures and that we experience having a relationship with. So that's the only real specific area of like physics and general providence interacting. The rest of physics could just be read or interpreted as instances of general providence. Special providence is where it gets more interesting because of the question that I've already raised. Why would God, or how would God act in the world if that action requires breaking the laws of nature? And the laws of nature seem to be set up by God as well. So you seem to have God acting against God. And if God is a perfectly rational being, that's pretty theologically incoherent. So scholars of science and religion have tried to come up with various ways to think about how God might act in the world in a way that doesn't break the laws of nature, that kind of works with the grain of nature. And a guy called Robert John Russell in the US, who was a quantum physicist and then became a theologian, came up with this idea, which he called the acronym QM-NIODA. It's quantum mechanics and non-interventionist objective divine action. Bit of a mouthful. But basically the idea is that quantum mechanics, at least the Copenhagen interpretation, seems to reintroduce indeterminism into the world. So with Newtonian mechanics, you have determinism, the idea that the past and the laws of nature mean only one future is possible. But on quantum mechanics, it seems like, at least in the subatomic realm, nature is indeterministic. You can make probabilistic predictions about what's going to happen in a given quantum experiment or event, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And the idea there is it's not human ignorance, it's part of the laws of nature, that it's underdetermined. So you don't exactly know where an electron is going to end up because there is no fact of the matter about where it ends up determined by the laws of nature until it happens. So Russell argued that actually maybe God intervenes in these quantum events. So chooses the location of an electron, for example, and through this can affect bottom-up divine action in the world. So if God wants to bring something about, then he acts at the quantum level, and through gradual quantum adjustments can bring about his will in the world. And when I discovered this, thought this was absolutely fascinating, creative, really clever idea. And I still do, but I don't think it's right. I think there are some problems with it. But I think it's a real...
Like God not existing?
Yeah. Even
I just had to say it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think that there are theological problems with it that seem to make it, were I a theist, I don't think I would necessarily think that God would work in that way. So one of the issues is that it takes a really long time. So a scholar, Nicholas Saunders, I don't know how he calculated this, but he calculated that if God wanted to redirect the asteroid away from Earth to save the dinosaurs or to Earth to destroy them, either one, if he wanted to redirect the asteroid using quantum adjustments, it would have taken 3 million years. So you would have had to start potentially before the dinosaurs had even evolved. No, that's not right. Anyway, but much, much earlier in history than you would think an all-powerful being would have to act. Like if God wanted to do something, surely he could just do it. But yeah, so it seems like an unwieldy mode of divine action. However, then Russell says, well, maybe we need to think about it as context specific. So it happens in physical processes that take a really long time, like the evolutionary process. So we're now coming to realize that quantum mechanics and biology may well interact more than we thought before. So an example is genetic mutations. There are quantum processes potentially evolved there. And so maybe God could use this bottom-up quantum adjustment mode of divine action to shape the evolutionary process. And I think that's much more persuasive. But the problem there is that we have the age-old problem of evil and evolutionary suffering, which suffering of animals, suffering of humans, particularly the suffering of young children who develop genetic diseases or cancers that are caused by genetic mutations. And you think, maybe this model of divine action actually brings the problem of evil up in a much more profound way than some other models would, because you have God so intimately connected with the natural world and with areas in which great suffering emerges. And you think, well, if God is causing all of this, why isn't he stopping this suffering? So on the one hand, it's a very brave acknowledgement of how intimately involved God might be with creation, with all of the problems that come with that. But on the other hand, I worry about whether it raises the problem of evil to such an extent that it feels incompatible with a loving God.
And I'm recalling a conversation, I believe it was between Asa Gray and Darwin himself. You maybe can correct me on this. Where Darwin, upon hearing how Asa Gray actually found evolutionary theory attractive for the problem of evil, because it's in one sense distanced God from natural evils. And Darwin was kind of attracted to the idea. He said some complimentary things about that. But then, what you're basically saying is God would be right back in it if this model was correct.
That's right. Yeah. And so there's a couple of theologians, I can't remember their names, who had this theodicy or response to the problem of evil that they call the not even once idea. And they say that God shouldn't act in the world to stop evil even once, because then all of the responsibility for all of the evil will fall on God, because he could choose to alleviate it and instead doesn't. And I think Nioda violates this in a way that potentially might be very theologically appealing for some reasons. But then we have the question of, well, why would God let somebody's child die of cancer before they'd had any chance to live a good and full life, because they had this genetic mutation and this cell growth and all of that? So maybe it's better to have a God who is a little more detached if you want to be able to explain evil better. I mean, this has been a problem for thousands of years. We're not gonna solve it here. But I do worry about the problem of evil, particularly in this this context, this argument for divine action.
Well, moving on in the story, how you framed the book, you also discuss the incarnation of Jesus with respect to our view of time. What did the two have to do with one another? What has the incarnation to do with time?
So yeah, this is a great question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about time, God and time and various different Christian doctrines. The simple answer is that we live in a temporal universe. So in theological terms, creation is fundamentally temporal. So we live within the bounds of time. There's huge amounts of disagreement about what time actually is and what it means to live in a temporal universe, but it is temporal. Setting aside all of these philosophical and scientific issues with what time actually is. And throughout Christian history, the prevailing view of God, not the only one, but the prevailing view, was that God was atemporal or outside of time. There are two views of God, so he's either outside of time or inside of time, but typically the idea has been that God has existed outside of time for various reasons. So one reason is that if God was the subject of temporal passage, then maybe he would be time's prisoner, and that would impact his sovereignty, his power, his freedom. And so the idea was that, God looks over the whole of time like you would over a landscape if you're standing on a mountain. I think that was Aquinas' analogy. But the Incarnation says that God took on physical, human, embodied form and entered the temporal world of our creaturely existence. And so I guess the question is, how do you make sense of that? So one option is to say, yeah, God is temporal all the time, because if you take the doctrine of the Trinity seriously, you've got these three persons. How are they also one if one of them is temporal, but or two of them are temporal and one of them isn't? Two of them are atemporal, one of them isn't. It seems to undermine the unified nature of the Trinity. But I mean, I get the classical thinkers didn't seem to think it was too much of a problem to have one Trinitarian person take on temporal embodied form. So yeah, I guess those are the questions that I look at in the book, and I don't come down on any clear answer really there. That's another area where I leave it up to readers. But the question is, what does it mean for a potentially atemporal God to take on temporality?
What does it mean for a God outside of time to also be obviously inside of time in the person of Jesus? Yeah.
Yes. And exist at a particular historical moment.
Yeah.
To live a life.
And not a year before then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a really fascinating question. And within that chapter, you discuss this concept that I have to bring up. It's the concept of deep incarnation, which just sounds really, it sounds. Mostly theological things get titles like Nioda. Not exactly the most catchy title, but Deep Incarnation does have a good title. Can you tell us a little bit about
Michael
what
Bay
that is?
movie?
It does. It sounds like a Michael Bay movie. Deep Incarnation. You're thinking Deep Impact, aren't you?
Yeah, and it's hilarious when you spell out the background scaffolding of the joke, Seth. Thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Deep Incarnation, it's an idea pioneered by Niels Gregerson, who I guess the idea is basically to, I don't know, would he think of classical accounts of incarnation as shallow? I get, would that be the contrast? I don't know. I mean, the idea is essentially that in taking on human embodied personhood, God wasn't just taking on human flesh. He was taking on, embodying, becoming something created and something part of the universe in a deep sense. So like, he wasn't just becoming human, he was also becoming ontologically united in some way with trees and grass and stars and the cosmos. In some way, the incarnation seeps into the very roots of the universe, and means that there is divine presence everywhere. It's not just for a particular group of people living 2,000 years ago. It's not just for a particular planet. It's for the whole cosmos. So I really, really like this idea. And I think it's one way to understand how incarnation makes sense in a potentially infinitely vast universe. It just feels feels to me, if God is the creator of everything, then why would it just be this teeny tiny planet, this species, this historical epoch that would be worth coming and being a part of? So yeah, I mean, that's the idea behind incarnation. I quite like it.
Sorry, Seth, did I cut you off? So I was meaning to. That was my goal, but I just wanted to make sure. Well, no, and that resonates a lot with, say, Jordan Daniel Wood's book, The Whole Mystery of Christ, on Maximus Confessor, where he says that creation is incarnation. And you might have seen me raise my hands when you said becoming, because in my book, Monotheism, I literally say the Christ is becoming itself. Because I see there's just, I think there has to be some sort of link there. Well, at least for me, anyways. Anyway, all I'm saying is I like what you said, so I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was no, and it's interesting to me because I did a talk not too long ago about how the Cappadocians, and especially entrenched within Eastern Orthodox theology, is this idea that humanity subsumes the soul of the entire cosmos in themselves. They love the idea of a microcosm, so that in the incarnation, Christ not only assumes a human nature, though he does, but in assuming a human nature, he assumes all of creation to some extent, which is just
the kind of idea.
Yeah,
which doesn't seem that crazy when you think of Adam and the dust as humanness itself, and the word human, hummus, anyways, yeah.
Where are you going? This is the top quality theology that you get from Jonathan Lionheart. You muted yourself.
I know. You muted me with your snark. You silenced my soul. But isn't hummus, isn't it, maybe I'm thinking wrong etymologically.
No,
doesn't it mean of the earth? It's of the soil. Yeah.
And it's the same, the Hebrew word for ground and the Hebrew word for Adam Adam are very similar. So Adam is a groundling. He is a being of the earth, as we all are.
That needs to be a book title, The Groundling.
Yeah.
Sequel to The Changeling.
Yeah. After we do Deep Incarnation, the follow-up is The Groundling. So,
okay, so I got to talk about this. We brought up Jordan Wood, who is a recent guest of ours. We also had Andrew Davison on a while back talking about alien life. And I asked him provocatively, would he baptize an extraterrestrial?
I bet he said he would.
Oh yeah, he did. Well, he says, "Well, I'd bring him to, I would do it. Yeah, I would baptize an extraterrestrial." So you bring up the topic as well of extraterrestrial life. Can you tell us what you say a little bit about that? A little teaser.
Yeah, so I actually use Andrew Davison's work a lot in this chapter because he's the pioneer, really, who's been thinking about this. It makes me think of a broader point about science and religion. So I had a conversation with a friend recently who said, I don't think there's any interesting questions in physics and theology. I was like, whoa, okay, I'm not going to take that personally. I obviously did. Yeah. But she, I think, was saying, there are too many unanswered questions in physics and we don't want to do bad theology on the basis of incomplete information. But I think theology and philosophy are more interesting, more creative, more dynamic when they are willing to be at the cutting edge, at the front line with science. So I don't know. I mean, there's different people who have different perspectives on this in the field, but not many people have written on extraterrestrial life in any really deep and systematic way until Andrew Davison. People have obviously talked about it, but his book, which came out, I think, in 2023, a year or two ago, is it's so good. It's this really rigorous, deep yet accessible exploration of what it would mean to discover that there was alien life for Christian theology. And so I engage with his work a lot in the chapter. And the idea for listeners who didn't catch that episode is that it seems very likely that we are not alone in the universe. We don't know, which is why there's not been huge amounts written on it theologically, because it's super speculative. But I think it's good to be ready if these discoveries do turn out to be right. But we're living potentially infinite universe. Even if it's not infinite, there's hundreds of billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of planets and stars like our own. It seems to me wildly implausible that we would be the only life ever to exist. And so, yeah, we haven't made contact with any other life yet. It might be that there's only one civilization per galaxy, say, even if life is really hard to come by, or the right conditions for life are hard to come by. That would still mean hundreds of billions of civilizations. So the question then becomes, did Christ assume the created embodied form of each individual alien civilization that was capable of spiritual sophistication, of effectively fall and then salvation? So there needs to be some kind of moral or spiritual sophistication there. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but where an incarnation would be valuable and important for that civilization. So does the second Trinitarian person become hypostatically united to various different forms of alien flesh, alien embodiment, or is our incarnation here enough for the whole of the universe? And to me, again, speaking as an outsider here, it seems I am in favor of the idea that there would be multiple incarnations across multiple different civilizations, so that the particularity of that species, of that planet, of that civilization could be known and understood by God, and this intimate relationship could be had. I don't think knowledge of an incarnation millions of light years away would have the same impact as an incarnation on your own planet. So it's a super speculative area, but I think it can generate some really interesting and creative questions. What matters to us theologically? What is an incarnation for? What does it mean to be fallen and to come to know God? And all of these questions, even if we don't have the scientific answers yet, the context of astrobiology and extraterrestrial life raises these questions in a really stimulating way for me.
So did Jesus become a Martian? Yeah, check out our book and find out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's likely that he could have been.
That is such a fascinating area. And again, we had more of that discussion. I loved the summary that you did, the sort of speculative work that you do on that. And I have to agree, this is actually something I completely agree with you on theology, is that it should be on the cutting edge. I think, when I talk to my theologian friends, there's this sort of nervousness that your theology could ever be put to the test, could ever be shown to be wrong. But when I talk to my friends in the sciences, that is the cornerstone of anything you say. Like, it should be testable. Like, you shouldn't even be putting something out there if we can't actually put it to the test. So it is
Seth
funny.
aims to be wrong twice a day, at least, minimum.
Noble aim.
It's when I compliment you twice a day, John, and say something nice about you.
Whoa. Okay.
I wouldn't take that if I were you.
No, I'm not. I'm leaving to go punch him.
I'll see you in a few hours. But yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. Like, there's a reason that this is a virtue in the sciences, and I think we've lost that in theology out of a nervousness.
We should be bold, and we should be willing to be wrong. A negative result is still an advancement in knowledge. I think that's how it's viewed in the sciences, and we should be brave and take that on as well.
Yes, thank you, Emily.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Like, the boldness should be there along with the humility. The problem's when not the boldness. The problem's the lack of humility when you assume that your bold statement must be true, and then centuries later we're still trying to get rid of it, to evolve with the sciences. That's the problem, is the lack of humility, not the boldness.
I agree.
Awesome. So because time's running up on us, I do want to talk about the last section you talk about on salvation. So what are some of the things that you talk about on like the Christian view of salvation, the end of days? Because you bring in obviously physics with that as well, which might be surprising to some people that physics has something to say about salvation and the end times, eschatology. What do you say there?
Yeah, so the last chapter is really a summary of probably, well, definitely the biggest research project I've actually done to date. So that was on time and salvation, effectively. And so when looking at time, the scientific dialogue partners there are going to be Einstein's relativity theories, so special and general relativity. And I look at what it means to say that individuals can undergo a process of chronological transformation, a change in time from being fallen to being saved in this life, personal salvation, effectively, or at least beginning the process of personal salvation. So this idea that when anyone is in Christ, he becomes a new creation. There's something fundamentally about your being that transforms and changes in this temporal plane. And the second question is what happens when we die, at the end of the universe, like at the end of time itself. So when the dead are supposed to be raised imperishable and they shall be changed, and the entire creation is transformed into a new creation, the old era is gone and a new one is coming. So effectively, yeah, it's salvation in time and then eschatology at the end of time. And there's interesting things to say there on both of those topics. So the main question I'm interested in terms of salvation in time is relates to this question of whether time really passes. So general relativity is more ambiguous about this, but according to special relativity, in my interpretation of it, there are other interpretations. It seems as though time doesn't pass in an absolute sense. So we have this phenomena called the relativity of simultaneity, which is the idea that there is no objective simultaneity relation in the universe, which basically means that there is no scientific way of substantiating this idea that there is an objective now, a universal now moment where, say, the future isn't yet real, the past has disappeared, and we have this flowing time of now and then now and then now. That's hard to, potentially impossible to reconcile with special relativity, because there is no observer independent way to say whether something objectively is happening now. So if that's the case, then it seems to me like it's quite difficult to say that time really passes. And there's philosophical reasons for this. I go into those in the book. It seems more likely that we're living in what philosophers call a block universe. So that's the idea that all moments of time exist like spatial points. So I don't think that India doesn't exist because I'm not there right now. But we do sometimes have this intuitive idea that the future doesn't exist because I'm not there right now. And the block universe says, no, time is a dimension just like space. So it's four-dimensional. I guess think of it like time is like an iceberg rather than a flowing river. And if that's the case, if we're living in a block universe where time doesn't objectively pass, we just have this subjective experience that it does, then all moments of your life exist. All iterations of you exist. Some philosophers like to call this being a four-dimensional space-time worm. So instead of being like one slice of the space-time worm, you are this whole thing from birth to death. But that seems to be very difficult to reconcile with the idea that you can objectively change. If all of my past moments and all of my future moments, from my perspective, are equally real, then how can I have ever transformed from a state of fallenness to a state of savedness or salvation? So that's the problem of whether there's a transformation. But there's also the problem of whether past sin can really be eliminated. So if all moments of the past exist, all moments of my past, all moments of the past from our perspective, if all of those moments exist, then all of the evil in them exists as well. And God hasn't really defeated evil in the way that was promised, or sin. So those are the two kind of interrelated problems there. And then the problem of what happens at the end times is more about whether there's anything left to be saved once the universe comes to an end. So the universe is predicted to end either in a freeze or fry scenario. So freeze is the heat death of the universe. Everything just expands and cools for billions and maybe trillions of years into like a soup of radiation that tends towards absolute zero. Seems like everything's gone. There's nothing to be saved there, nothing to be transformed. The universe, all the goodness in it has disappeared. Or Fry, which is the idea that gravity will overcome the expansion of the universe and everything will retract and we'll have a big crunch, the opposite of a big bang. Either way, the universe is set to come to an end. And that poses a problem for the transformation of creation into a new creation because there's nothing left. And a problem for bodily resurrection, like the bodies are all gone. So where are the physical forms to be resurrected? I don't think this is a problem if you endorse the block universe, because as I said, all the moments in the past exist. So the end of the universe's story is the cessation of everything that's meaningful, but God could just go back to the past and pluck your body out and resurrect it from there. No problem. Transform creation, no problem. But if you are what's called a presentist, where you think that time really does pass, and the future is not real, the past is not real, then at the end of the universe, everything that's ever existed has vanished and there's nothing to resurrect and there's no creation to transform. So we have these, I guess, there's a problem for the block universe and there's a problem for the block universe's philosophical nemesis, presentism. And either way, you've got problems raised for salvation and eschatology. And I know that's a lot of, I've just gone through a lot of information in one answer. So maybe we want to unpack that a little bit. But those are the two ideas that I go into a lot more detail in the last chapter of the book.
Yeah, maybe just expand a little bit. Okay, so the presentist, all that exists now. The past is gone, it doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist. I die, and then sometime in the future, God resurrects my body. What is the issue with that there? Like the idea that you think is problematic?
Yeah, so there's absolutely no problem if God resurrects your body really quickly. So like the example, the case in point example, obviously, of Jesus being raised from the tomb. The body was in there for 3 days and then the body is raised. So Jesus has died, and the past is gone as per presentism, but the physical body is still there. The physical body exists now. No problem there. The problem is what happens if we're talking about resurrection trillions of years in the future and the past has vanished, so all you have is what exists now. Well, if the universe is a cold soup of radiation that's almost its temperature is almost absolute zero, there's no body left and there's no past left for you to go and get it from. So what does God do? Well, maybe God can create the body again. God has perfect knowledge, will remember or know exactly what your body was like and can raise it. But that doesn't seem to be what's promised in the Bible. The Bible promises that what Paul says is your sown body is raised again. The seed that's sown comes back up. And we are raised imperishable and we shall be changed, but it is that body. Jesus's body bore the scars of his crucifixion. It wasn't, and the body in the tomb was gone. So there is the promise in scripture, if it's to be based on the resurrection of Christ, is that your same body that dies is the one that's raised again. And so if the universe lasts for trillions of years and everything is decayed, destroyed and vanished, then where's the body to be raised? So some theologians don't think it's that much of a problem because they say, well, look, Christianity doesn't expect the universe to continue forever in accordance with science. The promise is that God, as with the Incarnation and the resurrection, will intervene in history and in the evolution of the universe and end things and resurrect everyone, and etc., etc. So in the end, I think theologians say, well, we don't need to worry about that too much because we don't believe that science gives us all the answers about what's going to happen in the future. We have theological answers there.
Yeah, so the normal answer would be science tells us what would have happened if there was no direct intervention from God. But it seems like there's still that question of how is it my body? If it's completely dissolved, what's the difference between that body and one that just looks like mine, but isn't mine, an identical copy?
Yeah, and if God wanted to do that, if God wanted to create eternal, imperishable, sin-free versions of us from scratch, why didn't he just do that the first time? He didn't. There's something important about this body, the matter that makes it up, the relations that I have with other people, with the world, with God, if there is such a thing. it's something about this world that's worth redeeming. If you look at the entire, my understanding of the Christian story, it's that this creation is good, this creation matters. And so it's this creation and this body that has to be raised. And if you can't make sense of that, then you've got a bit of a problem.
Well, I have a final question. Though if Seth needs to leave, because I know he had an appointment, he can just leave. I prefer him not being here anyway. The final question is, I think you've shown a lot of where the science is inconclusive, or religion's trying to build stuff in a gap that might be closed, or to, imagine a time before the Big Bang, a time before time, and they're just sort of stretching. And yet, you didn't say you were a convinced agnostic, but a convinced atheist. What makes you go that extra step to say not just that this is a gap, but that this is something that I believe isn't there?
So I understand my atheism to be like similar to how I think about other people's faith. So I obviously don't know what it's like to have faith, but I imagine that it involves doubt. So a friend of mine at uni used to say, I'm a Christian 5 days a week. The other two, I'm not sure. Because faith involves doubt. And so you don't, as a believer, you don't know that God exists. You believe it, you have faith that God exists. And I think my atheism is quite similar. I don't know that there's no God, but I believe it. I believe it on the basis of my experience. I've never had a religious experience or anything. If I did, maybe that would change my mind. I'm waiting, God. But I also don't see, when I look around the world, I mean, really the answer is the problem of evil. I just see too much human cruelty and also too much suffering in nature. And I just think it makes more sense to me that this is not the product of an all-loving design. I think there's lots to be hugely grateful for about the world. Nature is beautiful. We're so lucky to be here. This moment is, in my worldview, all we have. This life, this brief moment that we're on this planet, in this universe, is all the more precious to me because it's all we have. I don't believe in some afterlife, some eternal future. This is it. And that view to me seems to fit with the world as I see it. There's just too much meaningless suffering for me. And so I think that the meaning we have isn't meaning that's imposed upon us by God. It's meaning that we create for ourselves. We choose what's meaningful, and then we go out every day and we try and live a life that matches up with that. And so yeah, I mean, that's atheism as I understand it. I don't have enough reason to believe in God, i.e. religious experience, spirituality, that kind of thing. And I do have reasons not to. Problem of evil. So that's where I've landed. But it's not, I don't know that there's no God, just like a religious person doesn't know that there is one. So, I mean, maybe we're all actually agnostics, but I'm comfortable with the atheism label for now.
Well,
Yeah.
You wouldn't have guessed it. You wouldn't have guessed it, but our next episode is probably going to be on the problem of evil. So thank you for segueing.
Perfect tie-in.
Thank you for segueing into our next the episode that we'll be releasing.
That can't have just been a coincidence. That seems too finely tuned.
Your religious experience, it certainly... No.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Yeah.
As a final sort of send-off, can you tell us more about where our listeners can find both information about you, works from you, about yourself, anything that you want to pitch?
So just to reiterate, I've got this book, Decoding the Cosmos, coming out with Cascade in at time of recording in about a month's time. You can find it on the Whitford Stock, which is the broader publishing company's website. You can also find it on my website. So that's emilyqureshi-hurst.com. And there you can find articles I've written, books I've written, and a bit of information about me. But yeah, if you found this conversation interesting, then please do consider buying the book, because I go into a lot more detail about all of that stuff there.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really great to talk to you.